Donald Trump carried out the first U.S. military attack on Iranian territory since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This was a huge escalation of the joint U.S.-Israeli war on Iran that began on the 13th of June when Israel launched surprise attacks on Iran with the support of the U.S. government. In response to Trump's attack, Iran retaliated, and on the 23rd of June, it hit the major U.S. military base in Qatar, which is called Al Udeid. This Iranian strike was very symbolic because the Al Udeid base in Qatar is the largest U.S. military base in West Asia, in the so-called Middle East, and it is the forward headquarters of CENTCOM, the U.S. military central command, which oversees military operations in the region. Now, given the fact that Iran was directly responding to U.S. aggression and hitting U.S. military targets, it looked like U.S. President Donald Trump got pretty scared, and he decided to call off the war because he didn't want to escalate further. It would obviously be politically disastrous for him, given that over 80% of people in the U.S. oppose this war. So after Iran retaliated and hit this major U.S. military base, Trump suddenly announced on his Twitter copy website, Truth Social, that there would be a ceasefire. He announced this on the night of the 23rd of June. Now, initially, there were reports that Iran had never heard of this offer of a ceasefire, but after Trump announced this, Tehran said publicly that if Israel agreed to stop attacking Iran, then Tehran would agree to a ceasefire. But it's very difficult to know if this is genuine or not, because Trump has previously used so-called peace talks with Iran as cover while Trump and Netanyahu were planning surprise attacks on Iran. And let's not forget what happened in January of 2025 when Trump claimed that he helped to broker a ceasefire in Gaza. He claimed that he had pressured Netanyahu to stop the Israeli war on Gaza. But then just 2 months later in March, Israel launched this war again on Gaza with the green light from Trump. So it's clear that this was not a real ceasefire. In reality, the U.S. was simply giving Israel time to recuperate forces. The U.S. was sending Israel more weapons and ammunition, and they were preparing to continue this war again. And here we are in June of 2025, and the war on Gaza continues even more ferociously than before. So the ceasefire was fake. And this is why it's going to be very difficult for Iran to believe Trump and to believe the U.S. government after Trump has repeatedly violated so many agreements, going back to 2018, when Trump unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal that the U.S. had signed in 2015 under the Obama administration. Trump sabotaged the Iran nuclear deal 3 years later, setting off all of this conflict that we've seen. Trump then later carried out a drone strike to assassinate the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, in 2020. So every few years, Trump has carried out another attack on Iran, and it's impossible for Tehran to believe Trump when he says he wants peace. And this is especially the case after Trump openly called for regime change in Iran, that is overthrowing the Iranian government. In a tweet on his website, Truth Social, on the 22nd of June, 1 day before he called for the so-called ceasefire, Trump wrote this, quote, "It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be a regime change? MIGA," end quote. That is M-I-G-A. Like, instead of MAGA, make America great again, it's make Iran great again. This is the sitting U.S. president calling for overthrowing the government of Iran, which is internationally recognized. It sits at the United Nations. This is a blatant violation of the sovereignty of Iran. And Trump was admitting what critics of the U.S.-Israeli war, like I and others, have been saying, which is that the goal is actually not about Iran's nuclear program. Of course, they do want to destroy Iran's nuclear program, but that's only a minor goal. The real goal is overthrowing the Iranian government and installing a pro-Western puppet regime like the U.S. put in power in 1953 when the CIA organized a coup that overthrew Iran's democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and installed the Shah, a brutal dictator, the king, who governed with an iron fist from 1953 until the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Ever since the Iranian Revolution, the US has been trying to destabilize the independent government in Tehran and impose another puppet regime. And as I have repeatedly emphasized, this is not just about Iran. This is not just about West Asia, the so-called Middle East. This is about the US empire's attempt to impose its hegemony on Eurasia, on the most geostrategic region of the world, and its attempt to divide the partnership between Iran, Russia, and China. It's a divide and conquer strategy, and the US thinks that by weakening Iran, by carrying out regime change in Iran, it can isolate Russia and China as part of the new Cold War. And this was admitted basically by the CEO of Palantir, which is one of the most powerful contractors of the US military and the CIA. The CEO of Palantir is Alex Karp, and he's a close ally of Donald Trump. And he admitted in an interview in 2024 that the US is, quote, very likely, end quote, to fight a three-front war against China, Russia, and Iran. That was stated clearly by the CEO of Palantir, and he has a lot of insider knowledge because, again, Palantir is one of the most powerful US government contractors. And by the way, the New York Times reported in May that Donald Trump is using Palantir to carry out mass surveillance of Americans, to compile data, to create big files on all Americans. So Palantir is directly complicit in mass surveillance, Big Brother style mass surveillance of all Americans on behalf of the US government. Palantir is basically an outsourced arm of the CIA and the Pentagon. In fact, Palantir originally received seed money from the CIA. It was partially a CIA creation, and one of the co-founders of Palantir is the far-right billionaire oligarch Peter Thiel, who also funded the political campaign of J.D. Vance, the U.S. vice president. J.D. Vance worked for Peter Thiel at his venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. So what this shows is how politicians in Washington and powerful U.S. corporations have been preparing for years for a war on Iran and also Russia and China because they profit from these wars. And let's not forget that the US government has been talking about a potential war with Iran for over 20 years. In 2002, US President George W. Bush claimed that Iran was part of a so-called axis of evil, along with North Korea and Iraq. This was a threat of war because when Bush said this, the US was preparing to invade Iraq a year later in 2003.
This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger.
Back in 2007, the U.S. Senator John McCain sang a song joking about bombing Iran to the tune of the song Barbara Ann by the Beach Boys. And keep in mind, John McCain was the Republican Party's presidential candidate in the 2008 presidential election.
That old Beach Boys song, Bomber Ann? Bom, 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 bom. Anyway.
Calls for war on Iran were repeated again and again in Washington. In 2015, the neoconservative John Bolton, who served as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in the George Bush administration, Bolton published an article in the New York Times calling to wage war on Iran. It was famously titled, "To Stop Iran's Bomb, Bomb Iran." Then, during Donald Trump's first term as president, he appointed John Bolton to serve as his national security advisor, along with another neoconservative war hawk, Mike Pompeo, who served as Trump's CIA director and Secretary of State. In 2020, Trump and Pompeo oversaw the assassination of the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, which was an act of war against Iran. And then in 2024, Pompeo insisted that the US government needed to crush Iran and, quote, finish the job, end quote, once again calling for war. And here we are in 2025, after decades of warmongers and neoconservatives in Washington calling for war on Iran. It was Donald Trump in his second term who delivered that war. Trump gave Israel the green light to attack Iran, and Trump also gave Israel the missiles that it has been using to attack Iran, and the US government has been providing Israel with the intelligence it's using to attack Iran. But it's not just Iran that is the ultimate target of this war. This is part of a larger US war on the partnership between Iran, Russia, and China. And now, over 20 years later, US war hawks are bringing back the idea of the so-called axis of evil to demonize Iran again, but also China, Russia, and North Korea. Some war hawks in Washington have referred to them as CRINK, C-R-I-N-K, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And in fact, in 2024, the US government-funded propaganda outlet Voice of America referred to China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran as a new so-called axis of evil. This is a US government propaganda outlet saying that. And the main reason that war hawks in Washington are demonizing the partnership between Iran, Russia, and China is because they see this partnership as a challenge to the US empire, the global dominance of the US empire that in the 1990s, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, was able to impose its hegemony on basically the entire world. There were no other superpowers. This was the unipolar moment. It was a unipolar world. But here we are today in increasingly what is a multipolar world. And you have the rise of China as a major power. China's economy has been larger than the US economy since 2016, when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity, PPP. And China has become the world's manufacturing superpower, representing about 1/3 of global manufacturing production. And it's not just China, but China also has a partnership with Russia and Iran. So the US sees this as a major threat to its global dominance, and the US is trying to divide this partnership. This was all spelled out decades ago by the late US imperial strategist Zbigniew Brzezinski, who formerly served as the US National Security Advisor under US President Jimmy Carter. In 1997, Brzezinski published a very influential book titled The Grand Chessboard: American Primacy and Its Geostrategic Imperatives. This was published a few years after the overthrow of the Soviet Union, and in this book, Brzezinski discussed ways in which the US empire could maintain its unipolar dominance of the entire planet. He was very concerned about the possibility of alliances of countries that could challenge the global dictatorship of the US empire, which is what it is. I mean, in the 1990s, the US empire controlled basically everything in the world, and the US empire imposed its policies on everyone at the barrel of a gun. It was a global US-dominated dictatorship. And in this book, Brzezinski warned that, quote, the most dangerous scenario would be a grand coalition of China, Russia, and perhaps Iran, an anti-hegemonic coalition united not by ideology, but by complementary grievances, end quote. And that essentially is what we see today, is a kind of loose coalition between China, Russia, and Iran. This is why the CEO of the CIA-backed Trump-linked company Palantir is saying very clearly that the US empire is preparing for a war against Russia, China, and Iran. The US has already been waging a proxy war against Russia for a few years in Ukraine. Now the US and Israel are waging war against Iran. The US empire is using Israel as its vicious attack dog to wage war on Iran, and China is the main target. So the US-Israeli war on Iran is not just about West Asia, about the Middle East. It's not just about Palestine. This is about the strategy of US empire to try to maintain global domination and to divide and conquer. It's an age-old strategy, divide and conquer. So the reason I wanted to provide all of that context is I think we should be skeptical of the claim that the US is brokering a ceasefire with Iran. The reality is that, as Trump himself admitted, the goal is regime change in Tehran. And even in the short term, if this ceasefire is real, even if the US and Israel stop directly bombing Iran in the short term, in the medium to the long term, their goal remains the same. It is to overthrow the independent Iranian government, to destroy the Iranian revolution, to impose a puppet regime that will serve US interests, and ultimately to divide Eurasia, to impose the hegemony of the US empire on this strategic region. That goal has not changed. And the fact that Iran has been able to defend itself and actually do damage to Israel, which is this big bully that is so used to bombing women and children trapped in Gaza, who don't have an army to defend themselves. All they have is local guerrilla forces. Iran is a major country with an actual substantial military, and Israel is not used to seeing any kind of actual response. And the US, I think, Trump got scared seeing the damage that's happening in Israel. So the fact that the US is trying to sue for peace, at least in the short term, if the ceasefire is real, demonstrates that Iran has been able to establish at least some kind of deterrence and show that it's willing and able to defend itself against US-Israeli aggression. I think that is a historic development. It is very important. Now, of course, we will see how things continue to develop in the upcoming months and years. It's very difficult to predict given all of the chaos happening in the world today. But if you want to learn what's actually going on, you should definitely follow our work here at Geopolitical Economy Report. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time. Thanks for joining me today.